celebrate the development, while others are accusing the U.S.
At dawn, the ocean looked calm. Too calm. Somewhere beyond the horizon, invisible to satellites and far from civilian eyes, a decision had already been made. One that would turn a routine naval patrol into the most talked-about military confrontation of the decade. What happened next would shock analysts, terrify admirals, and ignite a storm of headlines across the world. According to early reports, an advanced hypersonic missile was launched without warning from Venezuelan territory, cutting through the atmosphere at a speed that left almost no time to react. Its target was clear, one of the most powerful symbols of American military dominance at sea. Radar operators saw it only for seconds. Defense systems engaged automatically. Alarms echoed through the ship. And then, impact. In those first chaotic minutes, no one outside the battle group knew what was real and what was rumor. Conflicting leaks began to appear online. Some claimed the missile was intercepted just meters above the water. Others insisted it struck the carrier directly, causing fires and forcing emergency damage control procedures. Anonymous sources spoke of injured crew members, scrambled aircraft, and a fleet suddenly thrust into a fight no one officially declared. But this was not just a single strike. What followed was a rapidly unfolding naval engagement that tested modern warfare in real time. Fighter jets were launched into the sky as escorts and reconnaissance assets raced to identify the source of the attack. Electronic warfare systems flooded the airwaves. Warships repositioned, preparing for follow-up strikes that intelligence officers feared were already inbound. For nearly an hour, the situation balanced on the edge between containment and full-scale war. Then came the response. Precision strikes were authorized within minutes. Long-range weapons targeted launch infrastructure, command centers, and coastal defense systems believed to be involved in the attack. Satellites recorded flashes along the shoreline. Military briefings were abruptly canceled. Diplomats went silent. Markets reacted before governments did, and yet even now the full truth remains unclear. Was the missile strike a calculated message or a catastrophic miscalculation? Did it actually penetrate the carrier's defenses, or was the damage exaggerated to send a warning of its own? Why were certain radar systems reportedly unable to track the projectile until the final moments? And most importantly, how close did this incident bring the world to an open naval war in the Western Hemisphere? In this video, we will break down the attack step by step. We will examine how the strike unfolded, how modern naval defenses responded under extreme pressure, and what the battle revealed about the future of warfare at sea. We'll look at the leaked timelines, the disputed damage reports, and the decisions made in those critical minutes that could have changed everything. This is not just a story about one missile or one ship. It's about speed, surprise, and the fragile line between deterrence and disaster. Stay with us, because what really happened out there may be far more unsettling than the official version. In the weeks leading up to the confrontation, the situation in the Caribbean and the surrounding Atlantic had been steadily deteriorating, even if most of the world barely noticed. Official statements from both sides were cautious and restrained, but behind closed doors the tone was far more aggressive. The United States had increased its naval presence under the justification of routine freedom of navigation operations and joint exercises with regional partners. One carrier strike group, led by the USS Abraham Lincoln, was ordered to remain in the broader area longer than planned, officially due to logistical flexibility, but in reality as a signal of deterrence. Intelligence assessments at the time suggested that Caracas was closely monitoring every movement of the fleet. At the same time, Venezuela was facing growing internal pressure. Economic sanctions had tightened, fuel shortages had worsened, and several high-ranking military officers were rumored to be dissatisfied with the political leadership. In this atmosphere, the government leaned heavily on rhetoric about sovereignty and external threats. State media repeatedly accused Washington of preparing a naval blockade, while military parades showcased new missile systems and coastal defense units. Most analysts abroad dismissed these displays as symbolic, noting that Venezuela's real combat capabilities were limited compared to a modern carrier group. Still, intelligence agencies flagged the unusually frequent movement of mobile launchers along the northern coast as something worth watching. Behind the scenes, communication channels between the two sides had grown quiet. Previously used military hotlines went unanswered for days, and scheduled diplomatic meetings were postponed without explanation. This silence created a dangerous vacuum, where assumptions replaced dialogue. According to later leaks, U.S. naval commanders received briefings warning that Venezuelan forces might attempt a demonstrative action rather than a full-scale attack, something intended to send a message without triggering an all-out war. What form that action might take, however, remained unclear. The decision-making environment on both sides was shaped by speed and miscalculation. American commanders believed that the carrier group's layered defenses made any direct strike extremely unlikely to succeed. Venezuelan planners, on the other hand, reportedly placed great faith in a new missile platform they claimed had been upgraded with foreign assistance and advanced guidance systems. While public evidence of such upgrades was limited, satellite imagery did confirm recent construction near several coastal bases, along with encrypted communications traffic that spiked sharply days before the incident. Weather conditions also played a subtle but important role. A dense pattern of atmospheric interference over the region reduced radar clarity and complicated long-range tracking. Exercises conducted by the U.S. Navy during that period noted minor sensor anomalies, none of which were considered serious enough to alter operations. In hindsight, these anomalies would take on a much darker significance. The sea itself was unusually calm, a factor that favored both missile flight stability and naval flight operations, further lowering the perceived risk of sudden escalation. Perhaps most critical was the psychological state of the forces involved. For the American crew, the deployment had stretched longer than expected, with repeated alerts that never turned into real engagements. Fatigue and routine had begun to blur the edge of caution. For the Venezuelan side, the atmosphere was the opposite. A sense that a narrow window existed to prove resolve before diplomatic or economic pressure became unbearable. According to a later intelligence summary, a small circle of decision-makers argued that a limited strike would force negotiations on more equal terms. By the final night before the attack, both sides were effectively operating on assumptions rather than confirmed intentions. The carrier group maintained its patrol pattern, confident in its defensive superiority. Along the coast, mobile units were placed on heightened alert, their movements carefully timed to avoid detection. No formal declaration was made, no warning issued. When the moment came, it would not be the result of a single dramatic decision, but the culmination of weeks of tension, silence, and mutual misreading of the other side's limit. The attack began without any formal warning, in a way that later analysts would describe as deliberately ambiguous rather than openly aggressive. In the early morning hours, while the carrier strike group maintained a steady patrol pattern hundreds of miles from the nearest coastline, routine operations were underway. Aircraft were being prepared on the flight deck, radar systems scanned the horizon as they always did, and the mood aboard the ship reflected another day of extended deployment rather than imminent danger. The ocean was calm, visibility was good, and nothing in the immediate environment suggested that a hostile action was about to unfold. The first indication that something was wrong did not come from visual contact, but from a brief and unusual radar return detected by one of the escorting ships. The signal was inconsistent, appearing and disappearing within seconds, initially classified as atmospheric interference, or a civilian object. Such anomalies were not uncommon in the region, and standard procedures called for observation rather than immediate escalation. However, within moments, a second sensor picked up a similar trace, this time moving at a speed that instantly raised concern. The contact did not behave like an aircraft, nor did it match known commercial flight paths. As automated systems began correlating data across the strike group, the reality became impossible to ignore. A high-velocity object was inbound, descending rapidly and leaving almost no margin for human interpretation. Alarms sounded across multiple decks, shifting the ship from routine operations to combat readiness in seconds. On the bridge and in the Combat Information Center, officers watched as the projected trajectory sharpened, pointing unmistakably toward the carrier itself. The transition from uncertainty to clarity was brutal and immediate. According to later reconstructions, the launch had occurred from a mobile coastal platform, chosen specifically to minimize detection time. The missile's flight profile exploited gaps in early warning coverage, staying low before accelerating sharply in its terminal phase. Whether this capability fully matched official claims remains debated, but there was no doubt that the object was faster and more difficult to track than anything the crew had trained against in recent months. Defensive systems activated automatically, guided by layered protocols designed for exactly such a scenario. On deck, personnel were ordered to secure aircraft and clear exposed areas as interceptors were prepared for launch. The ship's escorts maneuvered to optimal positions, forming a defensive screen while electronic warfare systems flooded the surrounding airspace with countermeasures. For those on board, time seemed to compress into fragments. Commands shouted, indicators flashing, and the constant awareness that decisions were being made faster than conscious thought could follow. Within seconds, interceptor missiles were fired, arcing upward from their launch cells in carefully calculated sequences. Sensors tracked their progress as they raced to meet the incoming threat. Some reports later suggested that at least one interceptor lost lock due to sudden changes in the missile's trajectory, while others claimed the system adapted in real time, compensating for the maneuver. What is certain is that the engagement window was extraordinarily short. From first reliable detection to the final moments of interception, less than a minute passed. The moment of outcome remains the most disputed aspect of the attack. Official statements would later assert that the missile was neutralized before reaching the carrier, with debris falling harmlessly into the sea. Unofficial accounts from within the fleet, however, described a violent shockwave felt across the ship, strong enough to knock crew members off balance and trigger emergency inspections. Whether this was caused by an interception at extremely close range or by something more direct has never been conclusively proven. What was undeniable was the psychological impact. The attack shattered any remaining assumption that the carrier group was operating beyond reach. In an instant, a patrol mission had become an active battlefield, and the line between deterrence and open conflict had been crossed. As smoke drifted across the water and systems were rapidly assessed for damage, one thing was clear to everyone involved. This was only the beginning. What followed after the initial contact was no longer a single strike, but a rapidly evolving engagement shaped by speed, uncertainty, and imperfect information. As analysts would later note, the object that triggered the engagement displayed behavior that challenged many assumptions about missile interception at sea. Its terminal phase involved abrupt altitude changes and brief lateral adjustments, movements that did not fit neatly into known ballistic or cruise profiles. Some specialists would later argue that these maneuvers were less sophisticated than first believed, amplified by sensor lag and electronic interference, while others insisted they represented a genuine leap in capability. In the moment, however, such distinctions were irrelevant. What mattered was that the defensive envelope of the carrier group was being tested under real combat conditions for the first time in years. As the engagement unfolded, tracking data fragmented across multiple systems. Radar returns fluctuated, infrared sensors struggled to maintain consistent lock, and command displays updated faster than crews could verbally coordinate. Automated defenses carried much of the burden, but human operators were still forced to make rapid judgments about prioritization and escalation. The missile's final approach compressed the battle space to a matter of seconds, leaving little room for error. When the last defensive interceptors were committed, there was a brief, tense interval in which no one could say with certainty whether the threat had been fully neutralized or merely disrupted. The physical effects that followed were subtle but alarming. Several systems registered shock signatures outside normal parameters, and minor structural sensors recorded stress readings that required immediate review. Damage control teams moved through internal compartments, checking for microfractures, electrical faults, and signs of secondary effects. While no catastrophic damage was evident, the realization set in that even a near miss at such velocities could have consequences far beyond what traditional models predicted. The ship remained operational, but its invulnerability, a psychological shield as much as a physical one, had been decisively pierced. At the same time, the wider naval picture was expanding. Escort vessels reported intermittent contacts and electronic disturbances that suggested the possibility of follow-on actions. Whether these were deliberate feints, routine emissions misinterpreted under stress, or genuine preparations for a broader attack was unclear. Commanders faced a critical dilemma: remain focused on immediate defense or begin shaping an offensive response before the initiative slipped away. In modern naval warfare, hesitation can be as dangerous as overreaction. The decision to transition from defense to active engagement was made swiftly. Air wings that had been held in reserve were launched with revised tasking, shifting from patrol to strike and reconnaissance roles. Their objectives were not symbolic displays but practical necessities. Identify launch zones, confirm the status of hostile systems, and prevent a second wave from materializing. Electronic surveillance aircraft expanded their coverage, piecing together emissions patterns that hinted at hurried redeployment along the coast. What emerged was not a picture of overwhelming force, but of a limited network operating at the edge of its coordination capacity. This assessment shaped the American response. Rather than a single overwhelming blow, planners opted for a series of precise actions designed to neutralize specific capabilities while leaving room for de-escalation. Long-range strikes targeted infrastructure believed to be directly connected to the earlier launch, focusing on command nodes, sensor arrays, and logistical hubs. The intent was clear: remove the ability to repeat the attack without triggering a wider regional conflict. Weapons were selected for accuracy and timing, arriving within a narrow window intended to overwhelm local defenses without expanding the engagement geographically. From the perspective of those executing the strikes, the operation unfolded with clinical efficiency. Targets were confirmed, engagement windows opened, and munitions released with minimal communication beyond what was strictly necessary. Satellite imagery later showed concentrated damage in limited areas rather than widespread destruction, reinforcing the narrative of a controlled response. Yet even this restraint carried risk. Each impact signaled not just military capability, but political resolve, narrowing the space for misinterpretation while simultaneously raising the stakes. Back at sea, the carrier group maintained heightened readiness. Flight operations continued under modified protocols, with aircraft cycling more rapidly and deck crews working under conditions of sustained alert. The tension did not ease with the first reports of successful strikes. Instead, it shifted into a waiting phase, as commanders anticipated potential retaliation or asymmetric responses. Subsurface threats were reevaluated, airspace was tightly controlled, and every sensor contact was treated with renewed seriousness. In the hours that followed, information began to filter in from multiple channels. Intelligence assessments suggested that the opposing side's ability to conduct additional launches had been significantly degraded, at least in the short term. Communications intercepts hinted at confusion and fragmented command authority, consistent with a network under sudden pressure. At the same time, public statements from officials remained deliberately vague, neither confirming nor denying the full extent of the engagement. This ambiguity was not accidental. It served as a buffer against immediate escalation while buying time for diplomatic signals to catch up with military realities. What made this phase of the confrontation especially significant was not the scale of destruction, but the clarity of its message. The engagement demonstrated that even limited localized actions could spiral rapidly into complex multi-domain battles involving air, sea, space, and cyberspace. It exposed how quickly modern warfare compresses decision-making timelines, leaving little opportunity for reflection once the first shot is fired. For the crews involved, the experience was a stark reminder that the margin between routine deployment and active combat can vanish in moments. By the end of this phase, the balance of initiative had shifted decisively. The immediate threat to the carrier group had been contained, and the capacity for further attacks had been sharply reduced. Yet the broader implications were only beginning to emerge. The encounter had revealed vulnerabilities on all sides: technical, organizational, and psychological, that would be studied for years to come. More importantly, It underscored a simple and unsettling truth. In an era of advanced weapons and compressed timelines, even a single engagement can reshape strategic assumptions overnight. In the aftermath of the confrontation, the immediate question was not who had won, but what had fundamentally changed. From a purely operational standpoint, the engagement ended without the catastrophic losses many had feared. The carrier strike group remained functional, its core capabilities intact, and no vessels were forced to withdraw from the area. On the opposing side, the capacity to conduct further high-end strikes was, at least temporarily, diminished. These outcomes allowed both governments to publicly frame the incident as controlled and limited, even as internal assessments painted a more sobering picture. Casualty figures were never officially disclosed in full. Publicly, both sides acknowledged only minor injuries and avoided any language that suggested significant losses. Privately, however, internal reports suggested a higher toll than admitted, particularly in terms of personnel affected by secondary effects such as shock exposure, stress injuries, and equipment-related accidents during emergency procedures. None of these losses altered the strategic balance on their own, but they reinforced how even a brief engagement could impose real human costs without a single decisive blow being struck. Militarily, the most immediate consequence was a rapid reassessment of readiness and doctrine. Naval planners focused less on the specific systems involved and more on the broader lesson that assumptions about warning time and defensive certainty were increasingly fragile. Training cycles were adjusted, sensor integration received renewed scrutiny, and contingency planning began to emphasize degraded information environments rather than ideal conditions. The incident became a reference point in classified briefings, cited not as a failure, but as a near miss that exposed uncomfortable gaps between theory and reality. For the opposing forces, the consequences were more constrained but no less significant. The loss or disruption of key infrastructure forced a pause in operational activity and triggered internal investigations into command decisions and system reliability. Public messaging emphasized resilience and defiance, but intercepted communications suggested a period of internal blame shifting and uncertainty. The realization that a limited action had provoked such a swift and precise response led to quieter discussions about risk tolerance and strategic signaling going forward. Politically, the encounter produced an unusual combination of restraint and tension. Diplomatic channels that had gone silent before the incident reopened quickly, though at lower levels and with carefully controlled language. Neither side appeared eager to escalate further, yet neither was willing to concede fault. International reactions reflected this ambiguity, with allies calling for de-escalation while quietly reviewing their own exposure to similar scenarios. Markets stabilized after initial volatility, but the sense of unpredictability lingered. Perhaps the most enduring consequence lay in perception. The incident challenged long-held beliefs about dominance and deterrence, not by overturning them, but by complicating them. It demonstrated that symbolic actions could trigger real-world consequences faster than political narratives could adapt. It also showed that restraint in response did not necessarily reduce tension, but instead shifted it into less visible, more uncertain domains. In the end, the confrontation did not ignite a broader war, but it left behind a changed landscape. The forces involved returned to routine operations on the surface, yet beneath that normalcy lay a shared understanding that thresholds had been tested and found thinner than expected. What had once been considered unlikely was now demonstrably possible, and that knowledge, more than any single strike or response, became the true legacy of the encounter.